everyone, and special good morning to Helen for joining us today. And on behalf of Dolores, I'll just send her apologies for this morning's research bites. So this morning, Helen is going to talk to us about multi-species swords, a tool in the sustainability toolbox. Helen is a lecturer in agriculture ecology and environmental policy and director of the Bachelor of Agricultural Science, Agri-Environmental Sciences in the School of Agriculture and Food Science. She has a Bachelor of Agricultural Science and Agri-Environmental Science and a PhD in agricultural ecology, both from the School of Agriculture and Food Science. Her primary research is in farmland biodiversity and particularly the potential of multi-species swords to enhance agri-environmental sustainability, the development and monitoring of agri-environment measures, and the classification and management of farmland habitats and their associated biodiversity. So I know Pat's going to have loads of questions at the end for you, Helen. So if you want to make a start. Thanks, Mia.
Thanks very much, Geraldine, and thanks everybody for tuning in this morning. So I guess the starting point, we're currently living through a hugely challenging time for Ireland, for European countries as a whole, but for the agricultural sector within those as well. On one hand, we want to produce more, but on the other, we have to do this using less. We have a plethora of legal commitments to meet in terms of the Paris Agreement and what that means for Ireland. For example, a 30% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions relative to 2005 levels by 2030, meeting our commitments under the Water Framework Directive, and also commitments for biodiversity under the Birds and Habitats Directives. I suppose Europe's commitment to this space and I suppose reducing the resource intensity which we produce has been illustrated in the Green Deal, and two key strategies that are at the heart of that Green Deal are the Farm to Fork strategy, which has as one of its targets a requirement for 20% reduction in fertilizer use by 2030, among other targets there, and also the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2030, which is building, I guess, on the requirements of the Habitats Directive, and it's looking for us to use more agroecological solutions to meeting these challenges. So some of the work that we've been doing in the space of multi-species swords, I believe, will help us to address those commitments that we have and those requirements. Okay, so really for the last 50 years or so, much of the grassland research in temperate areas of the world has revolved around perennial ryegrass, and there are really good reasons for this. It produces well, produces high levels of dry matter, good quality forage that's produced. It's reliable in terms of its germination, and it recovers well following numerous defoliations. So all in all, it's a really beneficial or positive species. So, you know, the reason why we focused on that is abundantly clear. However, I suppose the problem is that it's also a nitrogen hungry species. So it requires feeding with an awful lot of nitrogen fertilizer in order to keep it in the sward and to achieve those yields. So the area that we've been focusing on for the last number of years has been to investigate if there are other sward types that might be able to compare to the ryegrass swords in terms of yields and good quality forage, and particularly multi-species swords. So just to stress, we're not talking about very botanically diverse old pastures or species-rich grasslands that you might find elsewhere in the country. These are specifically sown with a group of species that have been chosen for their agronomic benefits. And I guess the reason that they've been seen to be beneficial is that when you mix species together, they can use resources, available resources, in a more spatially and temporally efficient manner. So that's happening both above ground but also below ground. So you get different species with different rooting depths, etc., which are potentially able to take resources from different levels of the soil profile and use those. So this is the area that we've been particularly interested in recent years. And I guess our research in this area really began with the Smartgrass project, which was funded by the Department of Agriculture back in 2012. And at that point, we're starting with the overarching objective to identify whether there was any potential in multi-species swards to produce as much good quality forage under reduced nitrogen input conditions when compared to your conventional high input perennial ryegrass monocultures. To do this, we started off with a plot experiment, a small plot experiment, where we had 112 plots with different mixes of 1 to 9 different species, and those came from 3 functional groups, 3 plant functional groups, so grasses, legumes, and forage herbs. So our least diverse sward would have been a monoculture, so a perennial ryegrass monoculture, for example, and our most botanically diverse sward contained 9 species, and those 9 species included perennial ryegrass, timothy, cocksfoot, red clover, white clover, birdsfoot trefoil, ribworth plantain, chicory, and yarrow. And we had them sown in different proportions, but we also applied different levels of nitrogen fertilizer to them. So from 0 right through to 135 kgN per hectare per year. And we compared everything that we measured to what was going on in our conventional control plots, which are ryegrass receiving 250 kgN. So what did we find when we looked at the species composition, the yields from these swards, etc.? Well, when we look at herbage production in terms of kilograms of dry matter per hectare, when you look at this graph on the x-axis, you see the increasing nitrogen inputs, and on the y-axis is the kilograms of nitrogen, sorry, the kg dry matter per hectare. The different line colors represent different mixtures that we were investigating, and they're always presented in proportions, so from grass to legume to forage herbs. So for example, the first one, the green line that you see there, was a grass monoculture, whereas the orange one was sown with 55% grass, 35% legume, and 10% herb. And what's really interesting about this is that when you look at where the 0 N is going into some of those swards, you can see that a number of our multi-species swards were performing really well, even at that 0 N input level, when compared to the perennial ryegrass swards receiving 250 kgN. That black dotted line represents the yield from the perennial ryegrass swards receiving the 250 kgN. When we move over on the x-axis there to 90 kgN per hectare per year, you see that a number of those mixtures were actually out-yielding the ryegrass at that point. When you look at it in terms of spring, summer, and autumn, and the yields over that time period, we actually see a similar trend in that there's, the multi-species swards, a number of them are performing very well in all of those periods during the season as well. So certainly in terms of yield from this plot study, it was a very positive result for multi-species. We looked at the composition of that dry matter yield. So we looked at what species were present in the plots and how much of the dry matter they made up. And what's really interesting about this is if you look at that purple line on top, it represents the yield from a legume mix, a legume heavy mix that was sown with 60% legume. And when that's receiving no nitrogen, the yield from it is made up 28% from grass and 70% from legume. When you add 135 kgN into the mix, you're getting, it's the same yield, so you're not getting a yield increase in response to the nitrogen, but you've just shifted the composition of that dry matter. So it's gone from being legume heavy to more grass heavy. And we see that repeated again and again. Sometimes you will see a yield increase. So for example, with this one here, the 55-35-10, there was a yield increase as well when you increase the level of nitrogen going in. And I guess that's where people have to make decisions. Farmers have to make decisions. Do they need that yield increase? And is it worth it in terms of the financial costs of spreading 135 kgN to get that? Because again, you're just changing the composition of the dry matter that you're achieving from those mixes. We were interested in the wider environmental benefits associated with these swords, and this is just some of the work on the earthworms. So this is the biomass of earthworms that was recorded from those small plots again. And we see that where we have legumes in the swards, these are really beneficial for earthworm biomass, and it will have a significant impact. And we also had a significant response in terms of the herb inclusion within the swards as well. In terms of abundance, again, we see that the presence of legumes in the swards will greatly benefit the abundance of earthworms. And this is a well-known relationship, as I understand from Professor Schmidt, that legumes respond earthworms respond very well to the presence of legumes. In terms of what that means, well, you know, obviously earthworms have a hugely important role in terms of recycling nutrients and also in terms of promoting good, healthy soil structure. We also went into different sward types and looked at the number of earthworm surface casts as a measure of earthworm activity within the swards. Excuse me. And we see here that the different sward types we had were a complex, which is a 9-species mix, then a ryegrass and white clover, a ryegrass receiving 250 kgN, a ryegrass receiving 90, and then a simple or a 6-species mix. And we see that when we increase the botanical composition of the swards and have legumes in there, we get this increased earthworm activity as evidenced through their surface casts. In terms of water infiltration then, in the same plots we measured the rates of water infiltration and found a similar sort of trend there, that we're getting increasing water infiltration rates when we have that increased earthworm cast number. And when you put the two together, you find a highly significant positive relationship between the earthworm abundance, the earthworm activity as evidenced by the casts and water infiltration. And this could be hugely important for farmers who are operating on heavier soils, for example, and you know, where drainage issues are a problem, particularly in the autumn time. In terms of wider biodiversity, particularly with invertebrates, we saw benefits for parasitoid wasps, which are particularly important because they parasitize other invertebrates. So they are a good bioindicator of wider diversity within the sward. They can't be present unless their hosts are present. And again, we saw you know, an increased abundance of them within the swards that had legumes and herbs within them. Wasn't significant, but it was trending towards that. And again, beetles, a similar story there. So we're getting greater invertebrate abundance within these more diverse, botanically diverse swards. Moving on from that to a larger scale experiment that was established during the same project. It was a Farmless Experiment on UCD Lions Farm, on the hill at Lions Farm. And this is work that Cornelia Grace undertook as part of her PhD. And they established 4 farmlets there, so a high nitrogen input ryegrass sward, and then a ryegrass and white clover, a 6-species mix and a 9-species mix. And they stocked that, each of the 4 farmlets at a stocking rate of about 12.5 ewes per hectare. Again, they measured animal performance and sward performance on this Farmless experiment, and you know, just very briefly to highlight 2 really important results from this. the effective sward type is shown here on the number of days required to reach the target slaughter weight for the lambs. And it was found that there was about a 2-week difference. So lambs on the more diverse sward were reaching their target slaughter weight of 45 kg about 2 weeks earlier than those on the higher N input perennial ryegrass swards. And also in terms of the requirements for doses for animals, particularly the anthelmintics. So Cornelia would have measured fecal egg counts in the lambs and found based administration of anthelmintics on the egg counts recorded, and found with this work that with the more diverse swards, particularly the 6 and the 9 species mixes, that we're getting a much reduced requirement for anthelmintics within the livestock. That work has really led us on to the establishment of what's now known as the UCD Lions long-term grazing platform. And this was a platform set up largely down to the vision of our head of school, Professor Alex Evans, to address some of the really challenging and long-term challenges that are associated with agriculture, some of the issues, the longer-term issues that we need to be able to address and that we cannot necessarily address within the scope of a 4-year or 5-year research project. And those will be issues around carbon sequestration, for example, which takes a long time to show whether that's happening or not, but also the longer term implications of making changes to swards in terms of the profitability, the biodiversity, the soil fertility, etc. The first project on that has been funded by the Department of Agriculture. It's called Smartsword, and we're working on that together with all of these partners listed here. And within that project, we've established 3 farmlets, or on the long-term grazing platform, we've established 3 farmlets. Each of them are 8 hectares in size, so quite large scale at this stage. We've a conventional high nitrogen input perennial ryegrass control, a ryegrass and white clover farmlet, and then a multi-species farmlet, which is comprised of ryegrass, timothy, white and red clover, chicory, and ribworth plantain. And each of those latter 2 are receiving less than half the nitrogen input as the ryegrass monoculture. That's stocked, each of the farmlets are stocked at a stocking rate of 2.5 livestock units per hectare, and it's a dairy capped beef system that's in place. So just some very brief results from this work. So in terms of our sward yields from last year, dry matter yields, you can see that we were producing more on the multi-species swards than on either of the other sward types. And this yield was being achieved at less than half the nitrogen input that was being applied to the perennial ryegrass swards. In terms of the impact of that on the livestock, well, when you compare the bullocks that were grazing the ryegrass only to bullocks on either the ryegrass and white clover or the multi-species swards, they had a 20% higher growth rate during their 2nd year at grass. So they're performing very well on these sward types. In addition to that, we're working with Devonish and also University of Wageningen on a Marie Curie ITN called Heartland. And we've established 4 farmlets on the Devonish lands at Doubt. And again, we've got our perennial ryegrass high nitrogen system, a permanent pasture in this instance, so land that hadn't had anything done with it for a very significant length of time, and then a 6 species and a 12 species mix there. And again, those farmlets are being co-grazed by cattle and sheep. So just in terms of the yields from those farmlets over last year, you can see again that our 6 and our 12 species mixes are performing particularly well, again on a much reduced nitrogen input level when compared to the perennial ryegrass swards. So overall, I think what we've consistently shown is that we've been able to produce as much or more high quality forage from these botanically diverse or multi-species swards when compared with high nitrogen input perennial ryegrass monocultures. But we do have our challenges with these swards, and one of them is around species persistence. So going back to the work of Smartgrass here, we can see that when we, when we graze or we cut these species that are contained within multi-species mixes, they can have quite different responses. And this just shows the response here from cocksfoot over 3 years in terms of its proportion in the mix. And you can see that within the complex mix, for example, it actually likes the simulated grazing. So the cutting, it's doing better than in the grazing system. However, it is holding its own within the grazing systems. On the other hand, we have Timothy, which again, its response to grazing or cutting, it can be quite different. And we can see here that it doesn't tend to, well, in this instance, and from these plots, didn't tend to like the grazing. On the other hand, we have Ribworth plantain, which although it was reducing in abundance over the course of the project, it was performing better under grazing conditions versus cutting, whereas chicory tends to be the other way. So we do have quite a bit to learn about how to manage these the swards for the different species within them. And that's the work that we're currently doing. That's what we're trying to learn better is, what we do know is if we manage them like a perennial ryegrass sward and we push them to that degree and graze them to a 4 centimetre post-grazing sward height, then they're not going to persist in the sward. So we're trying to learn if there's a better way to enhance that persistence, but there's probably a role for plant breeding there as well to enhance persistence. Overall, I guess where we're trying to get to with this work is that we help in this mission to address some of the sustainability development goals, particularly goals 6, 13 and 15, so life on land, climate action, and the number 6, which addresses water and water quality. And we would hope that this lower input system, which is still high output, would certainly help to address those challenges and those sustainability development goals. Okay, while I've been the one presenting here today, I'd like to acknowledge that there's been a lot of other people involved in this work, and apologies if there's anyone I've left off that list there. But after that, I'll take any questions you have.
That's great, Helen. Thank you very much. It's very informative and certainly opened my eyes to